to field experiments, tremendously large data sets, small data sets to look at a variety of different social problems, from thinking about voting, intergroup contact, how to reduce segregation, how to think about just all of the issues around how to make a pluralistic society come together. He has also won numerous teaching awards and mentoring awards, and he also was awarded the Eric Erickson Early Career Award, which is also a name that is familiar to us. I personally came across Ryan, I'm not exactly sure when, I think maybe 4 or 5 years ago. I was working on a paper where I was trying to understand how do scientists think about diversity in an ecological way, rather than just focusing on the mind and how we perceive diversity. How is real diversity measured? And I came across his 2014 paper in the Proceedings of the National Academy of Sciences called The Causal Effect of Intergroup Contact on Exclusionary Attitudes. And it was an extraordinary study where he had Latinx Confederates on a train that was riding the train into Boston. I don't remember, well, it's every day for several weeks for a very long time, and measuring the attitudes of the people on the train. And then it was just an incredible, and I was like, who is this person? And so I have been a fan. I have been following his work ever since. I can't get enough of it. I recommend that you all read it. And he's just an incredibly generous person. Anytime I or other people, email him, he's always available to reach out. That doesn't mean all 300 of you should email him, but just incredibly generative. And I can just think of no better person that is my honor to welcome today. So I present to you Dr. Ryan Enos. Thank you so much for being with us.
Thank you, Valerie, and thanks for that. I would say almost embarrassing introduction on my part, because for all that praise, but I really appreciate it. It's an honor to hear those things from you, and it's an honor to be here. I know that even in a virtual world, you have limits to who you can invite in, and I'm really honored that I was one of the people you chose. And I hope we can learn something here together today. I should say I'll give 3 preliminary things before I get started, which is, one is I'm at home here in Cambridge, in my basement, like Valerie is apparently New Jersey, and so you may hear little things in the background. I think my daughter was just finishing up her virtual piano lesson, but I think she's done now, so you won't hear that. But the other thing is, if you were on earlier, I got my first round of COVID vaccine today, so I'm very excited about that. But any shortcomings in my talk, I'll blame on that. So you can be prepared for that. And the third thing is, as I remind people, I'm always so honored to speak to psychologists, because I'm not actually a psychologist. I'm not trained as one, and I'm very humbled when I'm invited in to speak to departments of psychology, because I've learned so much from the discipline, and it shapes the things I look at and what I do. And so I always learn a lot, and I hope, maybe coming from my perspective in political science, I'll have some things I can show you about what we're doing over here too. I guess the only other things I would say about that is that one thing I've learned hanging out with psychologists over the years is psychologists are more fun than political scientists. So I particularly regret that I'm not down in person with all of you to enjoy being together in person and having fun together. And we also have different norms of questions during talks, and I get very used to people interrupting me, and I actually get nervous if nobody interrupts me at some point, because I think you're not with me. So if we go long enough and nobody asks a question, please make sure somebody asks one. And in general, feel free to ask me questions at any point. Even though I've been teaching online for a year now, I'm not good at monitoring them. So feel free to interrupt, or maybe Valerie can watch them for me or something, but I do welcome questions or comments at any point. Okay, so let me share my screen here, and I'll share these slides with you. So what I'm going to speak about principally today is 2 parts of a large-scale project. One of which is about to be published, and the other part is an extension that we're particularly excited about, that we're still working on, that I really would welcome feedback on, because I think there's a lot of opportunity there that we can learn a lot about the world from. But we're just started on it, and you'll see some preliminary data from it that I think we can really do more with. So this is a project with my graduate student Jacob Brown at Harvard, and Sean Mazumder, who was a PhD student at Harvard and works at Google now in New York City with all of you, and James Feigenbaum, who's an economist at Boston University. And what the paper is called is "Childhood Cross-Ethnic Exposure Predicts Political Behavior 7 Decades Later." And a principal thing I'm going to show you is a subtitle here about the linked administrative data. And then what we do is we delve into this linked administrative data to try to actually get at people's attitudes and understand why their political behavior is predicted 7 decades later, and if in fact it is predicted when we look at attitudes. And I'll show you some evidence for that and some sort of non-evidence, and I'll be curious to know what you think about that and where we can take it from there. So oops, I'm sorry. I made my slides too big. There we go. Okay. Let me change what I've got there. Let's see if that works. Okay. Sorry. There we go. Okay. So as a starting point, what I'll claim to you is that despite decades of research, and a lot of it, we have very little understanding of what durably decreases interethnic prejudice. And that word durable is key here, where we can do things like in the laboratory, like decrease interethnic prejudices and a lot of different prejudices in the time we're in the laboratory, or in the time we're able to invite subjects back and keep track of them. We see some evidence for this, and it's powerful evidence. But durably, over the course of years, or over the course of a lifespan, what we might care about for a lot of reasons, the evidence is just not there that we know how to durably decrease prejudices between groups. And so what we're going to do is we use novel data combinations and some original data collection. We show that early life interethnic exposure is connected to liberal political behavior over 70 years later. So we're talking really durable at this point. And the intuition for what we do can be seen in these two maps that I show here. So these are maps of people living in part of Los Angeles, sort of in the south central part of Los Angeles, if you're familiar with Los Angeles, or in the sort of southern part of the city of Charlotte in 1940. And what you see on these maps is these are people that were alive on the census in 1940, and we see households, these square households are white people living in 1940, and these black triangles are households where the head of the household is black or African American. And what we're looking at is we're finding these people, and the people we find are these red dots here. We find them in rather contemporary times, and we measure their political attitudes. And we ask, for example, does this person living here, who was the next door neighbor, this white person that had a black neighbor in 1940, can we measure changes in their political attitudes 7 decades later, and compare them to, for example, this white person living over here that we can find that didn't have any black neighbors. That's the essence of what we do, and I'll show you the evidence for what we find here. So just to give some motivation for this, which I don't think I need to dwell on in this sort of group, but I'll assert that interethnic prejudice is a significant problem in diverse societies, and there's correlations for it just through the roof, both cross-nationally if you look at countries, and in subnational geographies, looking at states or counties or cities or whatever you want to within countries, is connected with a lot of things that, even though we value diversity on its own merits, we find that it's correlated with a lot of things that make society not work that well, probably because diversity often causes prejudice among individuals. And we can see this, for example, in well-controlled experiments, some of the ones like I've done that Valerie described, where we can see that in the short term, at least, interethnic exposure can cause some of these outcomes. That when people are exposed to people from other groups, it can lead to things like prejudice, it can lead to things like inefficient sharing and all kinds of other things that are socially undesirable. Now, we know that goes on. We've got pretty good evidence for that. And what that means is that in a democracy, that we're sort of left with sort of, and I emphasize that word democracy because, of course, in a non-democracy, people can be made to do all kinds of things they don't want to. But in a democracy, it means that either you have to have a homogenous place, which we don't want for a lot of reasons, or you want to have interethnic harmony. And as a solution to this problem of often in diverse places people unharmonious, social science has offered for a long time now the solution that contact, that when you have sustained cross-ethnic interaction, sometimes of a certain type, but when you have sustained cross-ethnic interaction, it's proposed as a way to achieve harmony. So if people have contact across groups long enough, they tend to become harmonious, and it can lead away from all these problems that have also been identified as correlated with diversity. And we have a lot of belief in that across the social sciences. There seems to be something that people take as a generally true thing. But one thing that we can say about this is, despite tremendous political and academic and legal interest in contact as a phenomenon, the evidence for its effectiveness is actually somewhat weak. I mean, the scientific evidence for it. So outside of the laboratory, studies that are well controlled that look at durable contact and look at the durable effects of it are actually kind of rare. There could be potential criticisms of some laboratory studies of group contact, which that they might suffer from Hawthorne effects or other sort of research-induced bias. But even putting those aside, durable effects are almost completely unmeasured, where we often don't look at subjects more than just a short time after we induce something like contact between groups in the laboratory. There's an excellent meta-analysis of this. I know there's been a lot of meta-analyses of contact, but one that I found very persuasive was this one by Betsy Palick and colleagues that came out a few years ago, where they looked at a lot of the aspects of studies of contact. And one of the things that I found most persuasive about that was this point that these effects are really the ones that are measured are not very durable. They're sort of short-term effects. And so we might imagine that a lot of these things could change over time, and we might want to know why. And that's a lot of motivation for the study that I'm going to show you here. So what do we do around this then? What is our intervention? Is we measure these durable effects of interethnic contact with what we think is credible causal identification. We're actually showing that this contact causes some sort of change in behavior later. So we take the 1940 US Census and we match it to modern lists of voters, and then we match it to original survey evidence. And this allows us to observe the exact residential context in early life when people are very young. And I'll show you that in a minute. And we connect that to the current partisan identity of over 600,000 people in 3 states. I'll explain why those 3 states are. And actually, they're just men. So there's some narrowing my sample here, but we connect them to men living in California, Nebraska, and North Carolina. And then what we did is we went out and surveyed almost 3,000 of those people, and we measure their attitudes about race and politics and some other things, and see if we can connect that to their early life exposure as well. Again, just as a way of motivation here, why do we think this might matter? Why might exposure across racial groups, which is what we're looking at, why might that affect partisanship decades later? Because that's what we're connecting it to, is people's actually political partisanship. And there's a lot of evidence that partisanship and racial attitudes are both conditioned early in life. I was talking about this with somebody earlier today, is that that there seems to be a lot of evidence that people form their partisan identities and their attitudes about race in their childhood and early in life in general, perhaps up until maybe their early adult years. And of course, as we've discussed, there seems to be some evidence that sustained cross-ethnic contact liberalizes short-term political attitudes. So we're asking if this extends to long-term political attitudes. And there's also evidence that racial attitudes in general precede partisan attitudes, that especially in the United States, whether people sort as Republicans or Democrats is often predicted and maybe even caused by their racial attitudes. And you can see this in long-term trends in partisanship. For example, when the southern United States went from a place where white people were mostly Democrats to a place where white people were mostly Republicans, after the parties sort of shifted their position on race, that people followed with their racial attitudes to resort through those parties. Okay, everybody with me so far? I think that seems like I think a lot of us would agree on that introduction. So let me see if you believe my evidence for what I'll show you here. So what we use is stuff like this. And I think this data is really interesting. So this is a form from the 1940 US Census. This is actually what it looked like. In the 1940s, when enumerators would go around and enumerate every living person in the United States, and there's some evidence they got close to every person. They got like 99% of the population. They would go around by hand, and they would go from house to house and write down the characteristics of every person. And this is one essential data source we use. And actually, I'll take advantage of the virtual environment here, and I'll zoom in on this for a second. You can see if I zoom in, I think that will work. For example, if we zoom in here, which maybe you can see a little bit, they recorded all kinds of stuff that's interesting to social scientists. So they have people's names, and that's important to us, and what their sort of position in the household is. Are they a head of a household or a wife, as they would call it in those days? And then things like their gender, their color or race, as they called it, and we're going to take advantage of that variable, their age at the time, and then a bunch of other stuff, including this, which is key to us as well, which is where they were born. And so you can see all kinds of, I think this data is fascinating, reflecting sort of the state of the world in 1940. This is data actually from the county I grew up in California, in Central California, the San Joaquin Valley. You see all these people from all over the world were moving there in the previous decade. One person from California, but Illinois, California, Denmark, Texas, Nebraska, Arkansas, things like that. And we actually have data on there about their occupation and other things. And so we have a very rich picture of people in the 1940s and actually who they live next to, because we have their exact address of these houses. And so we can reconstruct their exact residential environment at that time. So we take that data, and what we do is we combine it with data like this, which is, and I'm happy to talk about how that data is actually transcribed into usable format and stuff, which is actually rather interesting in itself. But what we do is we take that data, and we combine it with voter lists that we have of the entire United States, but we focus on 3 states, and we focus on them in the earliest years that we could find that we could connect back to 1940, which is 2005, 2009, 2017. I'll explain that in a moment. And we take these lists, and these are lists of every person in the United States, and they have information that we can use to match. They have things like the voter's first name, their last name, their date of birth. And in 3 states, they also include their place of birth, which allows us to sort through this data and find pretty good matches, because we can match on age, name, and date of birth. And then our key outcome that we're going to look at here is this variable on party description, where we're going to ask, does where a person lived in 1940, does it predict whether or not they're a Democrat or a Republican today? So we take that data, we match it, and I'll just talk to you about that briefly, is what we use. I'm happy to talk about this at some point if people care, but it's a process of supervised machine learning where we have sort of a combination of machines and humans doing this matching, because the humans can find things that the machines can't. And we match these across states where they record the birth and the voter file. And these are California, North Carolina, and Nebraska. So what this means is we're looking at people who lived everywhere in the United States in 1940, and I'll show that to you in a moment, but only to the people that are now living in California, North Carolina, and Nebraska, or we're living at those about 10 years ago. It's also that we only reduce this to men. So you can think about how that affects the inferences we're making, but we only match men because, especially going over the past half century, women were very likely to change their name at some point in their lifespan, and that made it hard for us to match. We've thought about ways we can get around that in the future, but with this sample, we didn't. So because of when these voter files are available to us, we measure California and North Carolina in 2005 and 2009, and then we measure those same states in Nebraska in 2017. So the results I'll show you have essentially 2 different sets. They have 2005 and 2009 combined, and then 2017 on its own, and they represent slightly different combinations of states. So we're just using all the data that's available to us in that case. But the sample reduces in 2017 because of mortality and other things that's going to happen. We match a lot of people. So if you look at the percent of men that are in these voter files that are old enough to have been alive in 1940, we find over 50% of them in 2 of these states. We can go back and find them on the census. So we find them in the voter file, we go back and we try to find them in the census, and we find about 50% of those people, which I think is kind of cool. We found a lot of these people where they lived in 1940. The other ones, we don't know where they were because we can't match them successfully, but we can match a lot of these people. And so we then look to see, did these white men in 1940, did they live next to a Black neighbor? And we find that a little under 4% of our sample did, and we're going to look at the difference between them and people that did not. And then we look at their political behavior today. So these are 2 things we're trying to connect. And about 42% of the sample are registered as Democrats, the racially liberal party. And so we're going to make this inference that if they're Democrats, we think they're racially liberal. And I'll show you some evidence that might make you question that in a little while, but that's the inference we're going to make initially. And we're going to ask, is that connected to them having a Black neighbor? So we're going to see if there's an influence in them having a Black neighbor on their eventual political behavior.
Can you please define racially liberal?
Well, that's a good question. Elaine, that's a really good question. And one thing I'll show you is that depending on how you define it, the evidence that these men have adopted racially liberal attitudes, which I still haven't defined, I know, is not terribly great. But in terms of the political parties here, what I mean is the party that seems to be in two dimensions. One is that the people in it tend to have more racially liberal attitudes as measured by survey batteries and things like that. So you might consider more racially progressive, you might consider less racist. You can look at almost any sort of different battery of racial attitudes on some sort of dimension from less racist to more racist. And they're correlated with political party in a really strong way, in the sense that in any sort of survey battery you want, the Democrats tend to be more racially liberal, less racist, whatever you want to call it. What I mean in terms of things like defining the party is that the Democratic Party tends to, in modern incarnations of it, tends to be more in favor of what some people describe as more racially progressive policies. So these would be in terms of things like affirmative action, different programs of the welfare state that tend to benefit minorities, things like that line up with the Democratic Party.
Brian, I just have a quick
yeah, please.
question.
Like I said, I appreciate questions, and Colleen, yeah, thank you for being the first one to ask one.
Because I want you to get to the results, but yeah. Is it safe to assume that you're looking at the impact of whites' attitudes as a function of having a Black neighbor and not the reverse, because you're trying to map it onto the literature, the sort of classic literature on integrated?
Yeah. So why don't we look at, for example, the effect on a Black neighbor of having? Yeah. Well, that one of the answers you gave is correct. That we just want to map it onto that kind of classic paradigm in the literature. The other thing is, our sample would get really small, and so we don't know if we'd have the power to do it, and we also might not have the power because the outcome we observe is partisanship. Yep. And there's just not a lot of variation among Blacks in the 21st century in partisanship. But I mean, there is variation, obviously, but not enough that we would sort of have the power to look at this. But what I'll show you here at the end is, again, we're able to expand our sample a lot and look back the other direction. And if you think there's interesting questions to look at, for example, of non-white people, how were their attitudes shaped by their residential environment, I would be really interested to know that, because I think we're very limited by looking at this sample, and we know ways to expand it. So I'd be curious what questions you think would be interesting out of that.
Great, thank you.
Yeah, thank you. Okay. Okay. So just to show you a couple things, we do this matching process, and this is where we find people. We find them in almost every county in the United States. And I think, like I said, I think this data is really cool. So this is where they lived in 1940, and people tended to live mostly in the counties where they eventually ended up in the 21st century. Like you can see a lot of people out there in these big counties. These dots represent the size of the population. I'm pointing at my map as I'm talking, and I should realize that you all can't see that. I forget this, but those big dots out there in California are where you find people in where they lived in 1940. Those are high population counties in California, and as you might imagine, a lot of people are still living in California today that lived there then. But you see people that moved in these sort of population movements that we know happened in the 20th century, because there's these big populations in places like Chicago and New York and such that migrated to the states where we're measuring people now, like Nebraska and California. And those are the sort of population movements that we know went on. And I think that's kind of interesting. But keep this in mind, that we're not just measuring people in particular places, we're finding people whose childhood context was all over the place and in many different types of environments. Okay, just to give you, I'll go through these very quickly, but to give you some, just some evidence, one thing you might worry about here is that the people we can find are very different than the people we can't find. So the people we can match are very different than the people we can't match, and we might have sort of a weird group of people or something. The evidence for that isn't really strong, and I'll show you some of this in a second. But first, this is just the age distribution of people in 1940 of the people we can match. And what you'll see is that most people were quite young. In fact, the modal year of age is less than 1 year old. So we're in 1940. Now, that doesn't mean their childhood contact didn't extend out past that first year, but the modal person we can find is quite young in 1940. And if they're going to be exposed in a way they understand to a different racial group, it would have to be in those later years. But some people are even into adulthood in 1940 that we can find in our match sample. So we have a range of age there that's more towards children. And then this is just, as I mentioned, how people look between what you have here on the left are people we tried to link and the people we ultimately linked. This is and these are between the two samples in 2005 and 2009, and this is in 2017. And what you'll find is that the distributions, I'll show you a number of things like this, look largely similar, where it looks like the people we found look a lot like the people we could have found, is what I'm trying to show you here. So that's their partisanship. This is in contemporary times where they live, essentially, the percent of high school educated people in those matched samples. And you'll see these, and unmatched samples, and you'll see the distributions look largely similar. And then we looked, for example, at about the racial environment they're in now, the percent white in where they live now in their census tract. And you'll see that these distributions look largely similar as well. So it looks like we did have a rather unbiased match, was the thing we're looking for that was important to us there. Okay, so let me show you what we found. I'll show you how we found it, and then I'll show you what we found. So just to remind you, the essential question we're asking is we're going to compare a person here, like this person at 2501 7th Avenue in Los Angeles. We're going to compare that person to this person, for example, lived at 2523 8th Avenue, and look at their contemporary political attitudes and ask, are they different as far right now as we can measure them with partisanship? So we're going to ask, is their partisanship different? I should be careful about how I say that. Okay, so how are we going to do that? Just to show, if you like equations, you can stare at that for a while. If you don't worry about it. But what we're going to ask is we're going to take each one of these voters, and there's one key to this, which I'll show you in a second, and we're going to regress these on the race of their neighbors. And we actually looked across a whole range of their neighbors, from, for example, the neighbor that lives right next door to the neighbor that lives 2 doors down to the neighbors that look 3 doors down. And that's what this shows here. What I'm going to focus on is just the neighbor that lived right next door, because that seems to swamp all these other effects. And then from those things we can get from the from the census, we control for characteristics of both their neighbor and the individual characteristics of the person we're measuring. And here's one of the keys. Is what we do is we look at these within geography. And so that's this G term. We look at these within geography, and we only compare people that live within the same geography. And we start up at the state level. So comparing people that lived in Kansas to people that lived in Kansas, which might not get you much. But what we do is we go down to what's called this 5-page group on the census. So we look at people that were in a series of 5 pages that were stuck together on the census. And what that means essentially is that we're looking at people that are within a very small geographic area, within just several city blocks, and comparing them to other people who lived in the same city blocks. And one of those people had a Black neighbor and one did not. And we want to know if their downstream political attitudes are different. And what we think is that that gives us some credible causal identification, because we're saying we can think on unobservable characteristics that these two people are largely similar because they're living in a very similar part of the city. You can think about whether you agree with that or not, but that's the argument we're going to make here, is that helps us get around a lot of different types of selection. Okay, so this is what we find. So what you see here is these are these different geographies going down here from largest to smallest, and this one down here in the bottom that says page 5 is the smallest area, several city blocks. And this is essentially the increase in the probability of being a Democrat in later life, 7 decades later, if a person had a Black neighbor compared to if they did not. And these are 95% confidence intervals. And what you can see is you'll see these effects moving around. Sorry, and this is this more recent sample, or the older sample, and this is the more recent sample. And so these people down here are actually older, and it's a smaller group. But what you'll see is that these effects bounce around. As the group gets smaller, sometimes these confidence intervals sort of pass over 0. But we see a largely stable effect of having a Black neighbor that is somewhere in the range of 2 percentage points over the course of a lifespan, that if a person has a Black neighbor at some point in 1940 and perhaps throughout their childhood, that they're about 2 percentage points more likely to be a Democrat over 7 decades later, that there's been a measurable and durable effect on their partisan attitudes. Okay. So let me show you, then we explore this in a bunch of ways, and I'll show you some of the exploration we do on this, but that's the essential finding there after all that matching process, is even down to this lowest geographic level, there seems to be some evidence that individuals have that there's a durable effect on individuals' partisan identification way later in life. So there's different ways we try to explore this to see where we think this might be coming from and see how robust the effect is. One is we ask about this question of a playmate. So one way you might think this mechanism works is that a person, a person's a young, in this case, a young boy, they have a playmate that they could play with because there's a neighbor that's somebody close in age, and we compare those, we subset to those people. It doesn't look like there's any convincing evidence that that's what's driving this mechanism in terms of differences in the size of these coefficients, for example. They get sort of noisy, they cross over 0 to even a greater set. One thing I should point out is we lose power here, and that's the reason we just go down to what here is known as a district level, which is sort of like a part of a city, for example. So we're not down to as small of a geographic level, but the results when we're looking at playmates don't look conventionally different. So it doesn't, if this is transmitted, if you believe this effect, it's not necessarily because somebody had a childhood friend, but maybe we're just exposed to a family. Their parents were friends with them. They saw them on the street, something like this, but not necessarily the sort of deep contact that would come from having a playmate. We could look at that even more detail. So keep in mind, we're looking at men here. So we might say they were more likely to have a male, if they had a male playmate of the same age, then maybe that was what would make it a real playmate. If they had a male neighbor of the same age, I'd make it a real playmate because maybe you're more likely to play with people of the same gender. And we don't really see evidence for that either. There doesn't seem to be, so again, this sort of playmate mechanism doesn't seem to be operating here. Then we can look at it across what we call here different pre-treatment variables. So does this vary by other different aspects of somebody's life in 1940? And so, for example, we look at individuals that hadn't moved in the last 5 years. So you can see that in the census as well. People that stayed in the same place, maybe didn't move away because of who moved in next to them or something. And you see largely stable effects. Again, our sample size is more limited, but you see these sort of largely stable effects. So it's like that the square there. We also divided it between the South and the non-South, as in the states of the United States, because there's a very different racial context in the South, especially in 1940. And so those are these circles where we're just focusing in on people that are in the non-South, especially because parties meant different things in the South and the non-South in those days. And we're focusing on those circles, and you can see these sort of largely stable effects there as well. So it doesn't appear to be something that's driven only by the region. And then something we hear a lot when we talk about this is, well, if you're out in the country, do you really know your neighbor? Maybe you're just, that doesn't seem credible. So we only focused on people the census defined as living in an urban space. And if I went back, you could see that these effects sort of appear very largely consistent with what we saw earlier if you just focus on people that are in an urban space. So it seems to be very consistent across a lot of different types of people and a lot of different types of places. And it could be that if you want to think about it this way, that could be evidence that we're seeing something that's sort of a very powerful effect of who your neighbor is that doesn't matter as much about where you're living. We can talk more about that. I'll show you whether some more evidence for that in a second. Just a couple of...
Can I interrupt you?
Yes, please.
This is Niall Bolger. I just have a question about what the sample sizes look like when you get down to what I guess was did you say the 5-page census level? I mean, that's a really small geographic area. And I'm just trying to understand how many matches how much you're actually finding people at that level who happen to have a... I'm looking for a table on... I'm looking for a table on that because we have a table on exactly that question. And I'd rather not just make something up. And if I can't find it in like 20 seconds, I'll just make something up. Oh, here we go. Okay, so this is so when we get down to this, let's see. So what you'll see, this is his answer here. So the 5-page level, what we have is about 12,000 subjects there. So we have about 12,000. This is a very good question because we're going to start to lose people when we get down to these small levels of comparison. And so that have a Black neighbor that are effectively treated. And then one that doesn't. We have to find both of those, right? And so the this initial figure I gave over 600,000 is just with no geographic controls, and then they'll get progressively smaller. And so this is a good question. When we originally did this, we tried to get down to actually the page level, and where we were looking like essentially within like 10 households. So this is going to be about 50 households is what you see there. There's about 10 households per page. So, and when we got down to 10 households, the standard errors blew up. We just don't have the power to do that because of this phenomenon you're talking about. But it's a good question. Yeah, it just makes it more vivid for me to understand why the standard errors are blowing up.
Yeah, and I should have mentioned that because one thing, if you're looking at those, you'll notice that I show you a lot of subsets and the standard errors change a lot because we're slicing the sample a lot of different ways. And so this is a good question, and I appreciate it.
All right, great.
Yeah.
And Ryan,
yes, please go ahead. Yeah.
I don't want to anticipate maybe something you're going to get into, but I had another question about potential confounding factors.
Yeah.
So if you want, you can finish up the section on
please go ahead.
Potential confounding factors before I anticipate something you may be well aware of. Which is just that it may be the case that if you're a white family and a Black family moves in next door, if you're more open-minded, if you're more comfortable, living there despite there being a Black family next door, that may be just an internal personality characteristic of the family unit that gets carried on from generation to generation, such that 7 generations later, you've got kids and adults who are more open-minded, more open to new experiences, more comfortable with discomfort, which is something that you tend to find more in a Democratic population compared to a Republican population.
Yeah. So one way to think, obviously, right? And so that's that's the biggest threat to inference here, right? Could be something that's actually a literal selection, right? Where you, I mean literal as a geographic sense in this way. You select away from people because when a family moves in, or you never select to live in a place in the first place where there's Blacks, if you're a white person that's not comfortable with things that are correlated with, or you're not comfortable with diversity, and that's correlated with Democratic partisanship. So there's 2 ways that we think about this, and you just have to decide if you're comfortable with these answers to this or not. So one is that we think these geographic fixed effects take us a long ways. And in many ways, we're relying there on sort of the historical record of things like segregation, where, as far as we can tell, racial attitudes emptied out like whole sections of cities. It wasn't like a person that was not comfortable with diversity stayed, and I'll use an example of a place I've studied before, like a white person wasn't comfortable with diversity, stayed on the south side of Chicago as it became a largely Black place if they happened to live on a block that didn't have an African-American neighbor. People left the whole size of the city in a big hurry. So when we think we get down to like a several block radius area, we're doing a pretty good job of holding racial attitudes constant in that way. The other thing that, you just have to think about whether you accept those geographic fixed effects. So the other thing is just whether we can capture those with individual level controls. And I'll talk about one of those in a second. I'll show you some more evidence for one of those in a minute. But one thing we try to do, and actually it says it on this slide, is we do our best. For example, we can't directly observe the partisanship of somebody's neighbor or somebody's parents, but what we can do is observe their occupation. And it turns out a lot of these occupations in 1940 are really correlated with partisanship. And we know that with some of the other data that people have collected, not perfectly, obviously, but strongly correlated. And so what we do is we control for things like the occupation of somebody's parents and see if that can make this effect go away. I think that's the next slide. And we see these are comparing these two different dots, that the original sample to what we do when we control for occupation, and they're almost identical. So that occupation thing doesn't seem to be doing anything. Another thing we do, for example, is we try to look for this effect of an unobserved confounder, and how big that would have to be to swamp these things. That's what this up here says. It's a sensitivity check. You can think about whether you believe those or not, but it's a method that some people use. And what we find is that with that unobserved confounder, it'd have to be really big. And attitudes obviously can be really big, so you can think about whether you believe that or not, but it'd have to be like maybe 40 times the size of the income effect that we detect in order to swamp these effects that we see of having a next door neighbor. But Colleen, absolutely, like a selection mechanism is the biggest threat here. And we can't observe attitudes directly. So we just sort of have to come in from a lot of different angles and see if you believe that evidence.
Well, and it's not devastating. It's just a different mechanism. Do you know what I mean? It is what it is, and it's wonderful. It's just a question.
Well, so that would be that could be I'd take that the charitable way to say it. It could be a different mechanism, but we would still be finding this durable effect, but it would be sort of through the mechanism of a family transmission based on people not selecting away from the mayor or neighbor, which I think is important as well, but different. You're right. Yeah. Okay. So I just showed you that. Okay, so I want to show you some other effects. I went through that stuff really quickly. I know I talk a lot, but I want to show you some stuff that I think in many ways is really interesting and sort of richer than this. And I'll talk about this for maybe about 10 minutes, and then we can have time to talk, because I'm curious what everybody thinks. So we showed you that white Americans today are more likely to be Democrats if they live next to a Black neighbor in 1940 than if they had not. But there's a lot of questions that remain, some of which have been raised, which, first of all, does this represent racial liberalism? People have partisan attitudes for a lot of different reasons. Like I said, they're strongly correlated with racial beliefs in the United States, but we haven't directly shown that's racial liberalism. We also haven't, this is related to the last question, we haven't directly showed that cross-section exposure causes this political behavior. We've shown these strong correlations, and we think that we've limited it in a way that makes this a pretty compelling causal story, but there's still obviously a lot of room for selection and other things that are going on there. And we also haven't said much about the nature of interactions. I showed these things about playmates that speak sort of to that, but we don't know much about what people actually experienced during their childhood. And so what we did is we realized we know where these people lived in 1940, and we actually know where they live now. So we should reach out and try to find them and survey them and ask them about their experiences in childhood and things directly about their attitudes. And so in the summer of 2019, we went out and we found 3,000 people. And I say that ended up being was 2,775 effective cases, because some of these people, we weren't sure if it was actually the person we thought it was and things like that. So what we're dealing here with is almost 3,000, but not quite effective cases drawn from these white men in our matched sample. About 1,200 of those are in the South. Now it'll become important in a second. And we contacted them via email and actually US mail, where we sent them actual letters and had them answered. And we got about a 5% response rate from the number we responded, which, if you know about like kind of unsolicited surveys, it's actually a really good number. So we were kind of pleased with that response. And this is what we found among these ones that we went out and surveyed, is we found that 14% had an immediate Black neighbor and 45% lived in the South in 1940, and 39% of them are currently Democrats. And surveying them about their attitudes, what it allows us to do is we can replicate our findings that we did with administrative records. I'll show you that in a second. We can further control for selection and other issues, like some of the ones that were raised here. And we can test for the attitudes underlying these initial findings, which I think are some of the most interesting thing we can see here, and collect a bunch of other rich data, which I'll talk about here in a moment. So what we did is we surveyed these people. And one question is, can we replicate the findings that we had using this administrative data? And so I'll show you a bunch of graphs that look like this, where what we do is we divide it in between the non-South and the South, because it turns out that's important. This is something, if you study politics in the United States, this is something you do a lot, is you separate your sample in the South and the non-South, because they just are very politically different places. And we looked at people that had a Black neighbor, that's what that yes bar is, and that did not, that's the yellow bar is the yes bar, and no, they did not have a Black neighbor in 1940. And this is their self-reported percent Democrat now. We just asked them, are you a Democrat? Don't worry about the party registration on the voter file, but are you a Democrat? And it turns out in the non-South, not in the South, but in the non-South, we find this phenomenon that we recovered in the administrative data, that they're much more likely to be Democrats. So there's another piece of evidence that we found something real here, that people describe themselves as the Democrats, they don't just register as it. We can see this both among our surveyed sample. We can see this both in the self-reported and in the voter file recorded partisanship. And we can also, and I think this is important in my mind, is we can see that this relationship is present when we control for parent ideology, at least reported by the subject. So what we ask people is, were your parents conservative or liberal, essentially? And then we put that into a multivariate regression, which I think I'll show you here. And then we see if that survives that control. So this is this relationship where we look at the probability, again, by non-South and South, and we look at how much more likely you are to be a Democrat based on whether or not you have a Black neighbor. And then in that regression, we put your parents' conservatism as reported. As you might imagine, people that say their parent was more conservative are less likely to be Democrats. But it turns out this coefficient on having a Black neighbor gets smaller, but it still survives in what people describe as this statistically significant fashion. So it looks like, at least when people describe the conservatism of their parents, which, is an interesting thing to think about what you learn when you ask people about their parents' own ideology. But nevertheless, in the self-described ideology, we can still see an effect of having a Black neighbor in 1940. So I think there's some...
Sorry, Brian,
yeah, please.
One more question about the effect here, the 0.19 for the Black neighbor. Is that 19% higher? Is that what that means?
Yeah, that's what that means. So that's a big effect, right? So you can see that. Yeah. Let's just look back at that to see if that. Yeah, so you'll see that reflected there, sort of in those differences. And that's way bigger than what we saw in.
Yeah, that's what I was wondering. What do you make of that?
Yeah, I mean, so that's an interesting question. We've thought something about that, and I think it has something to do with the nature of people that answer these surveys. So you can think about, that we're just getting a different sample. And so you can think about what that means with the results I'm about to show you, because I'll show you a bunch of different data we collected on them. But these people perhaps are kind of different in some way that is maybe biasing our sample a little bit. That's the only really speculation I have, because it's a lot bigger than what you see in administrative data. The only other thing I might say about that, though, which is maybe an answer that I like better if I want to believe these effects, is that partisanship as an administrative data lags people's attitudes a lot. So something we know from survey data is that people will register as a Democrat, for example, and then never change it. They'll just, they just because they don't have to, right? Like unless you vote in a closed primary, and most people don't vote in primaries, you don't care what your actual partisan registration is. So this might be more of a reflection of their true sort of partisan identity rather than just what they wrote on a piece of paper. So that would be sort of the charitable way of looking at this difference, maybe.
Right, but it is certainly not it's unlikely to have happened by chance, because the confidence interval is pretty tight around that.
Yeah. I think that's right. So I think we're picking up something meaningful here. Yeah.
All right. Thank you very much.
Yeah. No, thank you. Okay. So one thing we can do, and I just want to dwell on this for just a second, because in many ways this is the most interesting part of this project for me. Is it turns out one thing is, if you survey people that are elderly, and I'm sure there's people in this virtual room that have done this, but this was a new experience for me. They're really good survey takers, and they have a lot to tell you. And in many ways, this is one of the more gratifying research experiences I've had, where I was having people call my office, write me letters, handwritten letters and things like that, like responding to our survey. And one of the things and just learning so much from them, they would leave messages on my answering machine, just talking and about their experiences. Because one of the things we did at the end was we just told them what we wanted to learn. And there's something that we asked them a bunch of sort of closed-ended questions. And we just said, what we really want to know is what we're curious about, how your childhood experiences shape the way you think about race and politics later in life, something like that. And people would tell us a lot about that. And I recommend this, if you've never done this in some kind of survey you collect from people, is just tell them what you want to learn. And there's obviously problems with that. We all know that. But tell them what you're interested in learning about. And certain populations are really self-reflective. And again, there's limits to what people know about their own cognition. But I think you can see a lot of interesting stuff from this. So I just want to show you this. So for example, this is David, he's a retired physicist, that's what he says. And he was living in Cleveland, Ohio in 1940. And he said, my mother died when I was 9. My father hired a black housekeeper for a few years until he remarried. She was a very nice person. I believe this experience helped shape my liberal views on integration and civil rights. One of the things that's revealed is, again, he's sort of describing this contact hypothesis, right? But we found that a lot of the contact that people describe was in something we might describe as kind of subservient, where they'd say, you heard this thing about a housekeeper over and over and over again. And that shapes the nature of this contact in an interesting way, certainly not in the way Allport described as equals, right? And so I think that's worth noting, is we're learning something about the nature of the contact here. I'll show you some other ones too. So this is, where was that? Okay, here we go. So Frank, who was a retired realtor, he was living in Indiana, in Terre Haute, Indiana in 1940. And we heard things like this a lot, where he described his experience in the Marine Corps. He said, the Marine Corps experience brought me into closer contacts with Blacks. We lived together in close quarters, played sports together, and socialized on a scale I hadn't previously known. I also had my first contacts with Hispanics while in the service. My respect for all minorities grew during these years. We heard this over and over again too. And if you sort of think back to Allport, this is the classic Allport situation in many ways. But one thing that's made us realize, and this is not what we were examining with our data, but of course, experiences after childhood would be interesting. And for so many of these men that served in the service in the mid 20th century, they would self-describe this as their first contact with non-white people. And really their self-reflective view was that this shaped their attitudes. And you could see this, through a lot of their descriptions. And they would give these long descriptions of their childhood. I found this one really interesting because a lot of them were self-reflective in a way that they would admit their racist attitudes, which I think often, in my experience, survey respondents bristle at saying something that they might have an attitude that other people describe as racist. These survey subjects did not. A lot of them did not. They would describe it. Like, so this person described their childhood and they said, my Latino playmates and I often spoke disparagingly about Blacks out of ignorance or lack of contact. Later in the service, my attitudes changed. I still detect myself certain knee-jerk opinions and fears about Blacks, but have tried not to let these influence my thinking about racial matters. So this is, again, sort of a self-reflective person. This one I found very striking, where he's, God, I don't know, sorry, my Adobe Acrobat has started jumping around for some reason, so hopefully that won't get us in too much. It won't keep doing that. But this person said, "I grew up in segregated America through birth through college. I have no doubt that if that period had offered a more diversified racial environment, that it'd be a different and better person." I found this comment so striking, that people would be self-reflective about their racial attitudes like that. And people would connect it to politics. So this was a gentleman talking about, he lived in Missouri in the 1940s, and he talked about his change in racial attitudes over time and how that connected to his politics. In his mind, it was about who he married, actually, who was not from Missouri, who was from California. So maybe that made a difference. She grew up in a different environment, maybe. And he said she also, talking about his wife, she also contributed in a big way to my conversion from a youthful Republican to a Democrat within 3 years after we married. I did vote for Nixon in 1960 and Goldwater in 1964, but that was the last time I voted Republican. And so he would talk about his own conversion to a Democrat, which is sort of maybe what we're picking up. Again, not because of childhood, but people describing their own conversion, something I found really interesting. Okay, so one of the questions, though, that underlies this, I think these self-descriptions are really interesting, and I could read these all day. But one of the questions that underlies this is, are we really picking up racial liberalism? Are we just sort of picking up something else about the parties? Because, like I said, people have joined parties for a lot of reasons. So one thing is, we can explore in more details. We just ask them about their ideology, like, are you a liberal rather than just a Democrat? And these are these same colors again, where yellow is people that are had a Black neighbor in 1940, and blue is people that did not. And we see that that distribution has shifted to the left. So that's some evidence that they actually are more liberal in a general term. We're just asking them, as political scientists do, on a 7-point scale from liberal to conservative. They're more liberal. But what about racial liberalism? And so we tried to measure that in a bunch of different ways. And we looked at 4 different ways of measuring it. We said these are things that political scientists use, and they seep into psychology occasionally, is we use something called the modern racism scale. We asked about what we might consider old-fashioned racism. I'll show you that in a second. Something that people like Don Kinder call ethnocentrism. And I'll show you that. And then we measured these latent racist attitudes from asking people about their ideologies, or sorry, about their policy attitudes. So let me show you those here, and then I'll wrap up. So this is this modern racism scale that David Sears and Don Kinder invented back in the 1970s and 80s, which was this idea of capturing sort of what they at the time called modern attitudes about race. And you see this all over the place in surveys now. The idea was that people had abandoned, white people in this case, had abandoned sort of ideas of biological inferiority for non-whites, and rather that they violated some sort of, they violated the American work ethic, non-whites did. And therefore they would hold negative attitudes about certain aspects of work ethic and other things about non-white groups, particularly African Americans. And so you ask them a series of these questions, and it turns out they're highly predictive of partisanship and a bunch of other things, and is a really common way of measuring racial attitudes. What we found, though, these are the distributions of those attitudes when you scale them from 0 to 1, is that the difference between people that did have a Black neighbor and did not in 1940 are essentially 0 in the South and the non-South. We can't pick up any difference in racial liberalism as measured by this modern racism scale. So we asked them other ways to measure racism. We said, well, what about what we can think of something that's more old-fashioned racism? Because of course, those attitude scales were supposed to be for people that changed their attitudes and adopted modern racism in the 1980s. What about those sort of racial attitudes that were important when these individuals were being socialized? So we asked them about things like, should Blacks and whites date each other? Would you live in a neighborhood among these white people? Would you live in a neighborhood that had Black people? And we looked for differences in those attitudes that might be considered more old-fashioned. And what we found is a similar phenomenon where we don't see differences between people that had a Black and white neighbor. There's essentially no difference between them. Then we looked at these scales called ethnocentrism that Don Kinder, the political psychologist at Michigan, adopted from some other people, where he would ask them these very sort of blatantly racist questions about whether or not groups are intelligent or hardworking or trustworthy. and then look at the difference between how you describe your own group and how you describe other groups. And that's the essential scale that he would create, and see if you're more willing to attribute these negative attitudes towards other groups rather than your own, and call that ethnocentrism. And again, we find essentially no difference between people that did and did not have a Black neighbor in 1940. Okay, so we looked at one more thing, which was we then asked them a whole bunch of questions about policy, and we tried to extract what we call a latent dimension of racism there. So we asked them about things that were actually we know were attitudes by looking at old survey data that had a lot of variation in answers throughout surveys going from like the 1950s till now. There's a whole series in here which you could see questions about affirmative action, questions about integration, questions about whether or not presidents were pushing integration fast enough. And what we did is we tried to scale a lot of these into a single dimension that sort of captured race using these latent ideology scales, which we could talk about if you're curious. But we found that essentially only 6 of these really had any variation. And so we created a dimension with that, a dimension of racial liberalism, if you will, using that. And what we found again is we can't really detect any difference between people that did and did not have a Black neighbor using those dimensions as well. Okay, so one more thing, I'll show you one more piece of data. So one more thing to say, maybe this looks like racial liberalism, even though we can't see it in the survey data, which I think is interesting, is we could say, does this represent racially motivated behavior? We looked and said, did people switch parties? So we actually asked you, did you ever belong to a different political party? And they would say yes. We'd ask them when. And when we look at the years people changed, you see them a lot. So these are, the blue dots are people that didn't have a Black neighbor. The yellow dots are people that did. And they're scaled by the sort of the size of people in that year. And what we find is that we found that most people did their party switching in the 1960s, which is when the parties were actually switching places, if you know about US political history, on racial issues. The Democrats were becoming the party of sort of racial liberalism at that time. And so what's interesting about that is if you then look at these, and this is just people that quit the Democrats. So more people quitting the Democrats, meaning leaving the Democratic Party at some part of their life and becoming a Republican. You could obviously flip this other way if you wanted to. And what we find is that people that did not have a Black neighbor were more likely to at some point in their life say that I'm going to become a Republican essentially, or I'm going to leave the Democratic Party and maybe become an independent. And again, we don't know what that represents, but given that the major change among these parties was over the course of their lifespan was around racial issues, it seems like there maybe is something going on there. So one of the things I think is really interesting as a takeaway here is that we show these large scale correlations. We show things that are in many ways circumstantial of these having to do with race, but we can't pick it up in the survey data using the instruments we have. And so there's a lot to reflect on there. And one might be, we have all these sort of very attitude specific ways of measuring race, like modern racism, old fashioned racism, but maybe those tools are not just adequate for this purpose for measuring attitudes that were specific to people that were socialized in a very particular time in American history. So we can't see it there, even though we can see it when we control for a lot of other things and use these administrative outcomes. Okay, so just 2 things, then I'm gonna be quiet. And I appreciate everybody listening to me for this long, what we want to do next is we want to better understand why racially liberal partisan identification, even movement to the racially liberal party, is not reflected in these racially liberal survey attitudes as we have them. And so the thing that I think is really exciting about this is, so we have the data and we have the technology actually to greatly expand the survey, and we've been meaning to do it over the past couple of years, but there was a pandemic and all this other stuff. So it's given us a lot of time to think about it while we haven't been able to roll this out, is that we can expand the survey, including the gender and including across racial groups. And we think so we can get women in this case, and we don't have to limit it to just white men, is we think we can contact approximately 4 million people. We have the data to do that. We're not gonna get 4 million responses back, but we could be left with hundreds of thousands of responses and connect them actually, again, directly to the 1940 census. We know how to do that. And we could even move backward to the 1930 census and soon be able to move forward to the 1950 census. And so we could have hundreds of thousands of survey responses here that we think could be very meaningful. We really are trying to figure out what to ask to try to sort of crack this about what is going on in these people's heads. What can we learn from them? Okay, so I know I talked a lot there, and I really appreciate, I'll stop sharing my screen here. And I should actually say just briefly that this was funded by the Inequality in America Initiative at Harvard and the Russell Sage Foundation. And Don Valentino, who's one of my PhD students, did some research assistance for us and is also moving on to authorship in these later projects. So we thank him too, and my co-authors as well. So thanks to everybody for listening, and I really look forward to any questions or comments comments or anything anybody may have.
Thank you. I will let you just field the questions.
Okay, so will people raise their blue hand, or how do we usually do it around here? Do they?
I think.
Or just shout out. I don't know.
Yeah, I think people can just shout out.
Yeah, please.
And I'll sort of start. I'll just
please take your moderators.
Incredible. I'm familiar with your work, so I always know how you're trying to cut it at multiple joints to think about sort of causal inference. And but I had a sort of pretty simple question, which is many people in our department study memory and learning, and what I'm interested in is, did you ask people if they remember whether they had a Black neighbor and whether that had an influence on them? Because that's actually what you were trying to figure out. And what I think it was interesting, at least in the snippets of stories that you shared with us, it seems like people are sort of moving forward in time. And we know Americans in general love conversion stories, so they come up with a narrative that makes sense for them about their own conversion experience, as opposed to like, I just had this Black neighbor and whatever. So, but I'm curious if one, if they remembered, and two, if they could reflect on that.
Yeah, so that's a fantastic question, Valerie. So I'll say, so the answer is we did ask them this. So we asked them like a lot of detailed questions about their childhood, and so we asked them, like, specifically, did you have a Black neighbor? So we asked them about their play groups, or their childhood in school, and all these sort of things. We asked them specifically, do you have a Black neighbor? And so and it turns out there's a high degree of correspondence between that and what we see on the census. And one thing we learned, though, is not always, and I found this kind of interesting, is sometimes people would say, I did not have a Black neighbor. And then we look at the census and they would say they did. And so there's two different ways this could go. One is the census could just be wrong because there's measurement error on there, or they could be wrong if they have a faulty memory or something. Or it could be there's a difference in what people think about as a neighbor. So this is where it's confusing, because, what made me realize this is we'd see a lot of these, again, in these open-ended responses, where they'd say, there was a Black family that lived above my garage or something like that. And that's where my contact with Black people came from. And I think often when you ask people, like, were they a neighbor, that's not what they're thinking of. They were thinking like somebody that lived in the house next door to them, or something that, they sort of thought of as an equal or something. And so that's one of these things where we're reflecting on how to ask that question more, in a more holistic way, I guess you could say, in the next time we do the survey. And to answer your question, but we have not actually, and I think this is a very good idea, we haven't actually looked at using that as our independent variable, if you will. Like, do you remember having a Black neighbor? Using that as the predictor variable. We haven't done that. I think that's a very good suggestion.
Yep. The reason why I was asking is because neighbor has an equal status connotation to it, as opposed to, I wasn't thinking about a person above the garage, but I was thinking about a person who lives in the basement.
Yeah, housekeeper, exactly. Yeah.
Or the person who happens to be next door, so they would be in the census, but somebody else owns the house and they just, and they're there. And so, but the word neighbor has the conditions of equal status as opposed to the person next door, and that. So anyway,
no, absolutely. And I can't remember if you're 100% right. And I can't remember if we actually used the word neighbor, because we might have thought of it like that far, that maybe neighbor means equal status. But we asked about something that we, in retrospect, we knew obviously didn't capture the whole, all the circumstances in which one could live next to them. And they connotate things like equality, I think, are important. You're absolutely right. Other questions? Comments?
Let me see. I'm looking in the chat room.
I don't have a question, but I just wanted to say that I really appreciated the ethnographic flair of just directly asking people, do you know what I mean? I think in the world of psychology that sometimes gets lost a little bit, and it's maybe even like there's like a snobbish feeling towards it, right? Where you're like, what is this, sociology? Get a Likert scale on there. But oftentimes it does yield some of the richest information. I definitely appreciate that you did that.
Yeah, well, so thank you for saying that. And I should say, I mean, you have an interesting thing about political science as a discipline is, the charitable way to say is that we're like high in the food chain in the sense that we eat from a lot of other disciplines, but it's also this, we don't do anything original, right? So we just borrow from other disciplines. And so political science actually divides into kind of like warring camps about whether they borrow from sociology, psychology, or economics. And I often try to think of myself as one that like bridges those camps, but nevertheless, like there's often like a snobbery around like ethnographic research and political science too among some people, right? And so I wasn't like trained to do that. In some ways, these are just kind of things that we sort of like threw on there at the end. And I shouldn't say I wasn't trained. Like I actually go out and talk to people in my research a lot, and I think you learn a lot from that. Like especially because I studied geography, you should like go to geography places and talk to people. But I don't usually look at like open-ended responses on surveys. And I think we didn't think we'd get a lot from that, but this experience of people like calling my office and saying like, I want to tell you something, and just like, talking to me and leaving messages on my machine, talking about their life, you learn a lot from that. And it doesn't necessarily mean that you want to take like super strong inferences from it because of, like Valerie said, people love, stories about conversion and things. But especially when you think about how one would design a survey in the future, it reveals a lot too, because like there's just things we didn't think of that people tell us about in their own life. And I do think, and I'm sure there's people that would know the answer to this better than I would, but I think that in some ways when people reach old age, there's a motivation for self-reflection in some ways that really does maybe make them, I don't know if honest is quite the right word, but there seems to be in my read like a sort of almost like naked aspect of their survey responses where they were just really opening up and they want to tell people about their life and tell people about what they think. And I think you learn a lot from that.
It feels pedagogical to me. I think the older you get, the more pedagogical you get, where it's like, look, I've done this and here's where I went wrong. You know what I mean?
Right, sure.
Like, learn from me. Don't recreate this.
Yeah, that's a good way to put it, I think.
Ryan, I wanted to ask you about your plans to follow up on this. And you had mentioned possibly going back to the 1930 census and forward to the 1950 census.
Yeah.
Do you think you'd get enough people if you went back to the 1930 census, just given the ages? I mean,
Sure. Well, it depends on what you mean by enough. I mean, I think it'd be severely limited, right? So when you look at that age distribution, actually there were a lot of people that were alive, old enough to be alive in the 1930s, if we put that back up, because there was a very non-trivial number of people that were over 10 years old, for example. But then they have to respond, and I mean, to be dark, mortality catches up quickly with people at this age group. So like every month that passes, we lose people, and so I don't know. But one thing is, once we worked out this sort of technology of matching, that's not the hard part. So we can match people, and the way we mostly contact these people, just because it's so efficient, is over email. And so, it's just inexpensive to do, and we can go get them. And we have a lot of their email addresses. And then 1950, so the way this data works, if you're not familiar with it, is it gets released after 72 years. You can get de-anonymized census data. And so we're right around the corner from 1950, and we'll have an even larger group available to us, easier matching and things like that. And so that's what I mean. I think there's just a lot of opportunity available to learn about people, that if you're interested in sort of how context and time periods and all these things shape people's attitudes and behaviors, they lived through such a varied time in American history where things like segregation and the state and the military and everything was changing. I really want to learn from these people. So I'm looking forward to getting that sample if we can get our act together and get it moving.
Yeah, I think that would be wonderful, because and the addition of women shouldn't be underestimated. That would be fantastic too, because I could see different processes, different kinds of exposure to different kinds of ways of interacting. So
yeah, well, and the thing sorry, go ahead.
And a much bigger sample, presumably, from 19.
Yeah, I was just going to say, to your point, Neil, I think women drive moves in a way that men don't. And I think that's going to be very, very, right? Like, women do set the tone for the household and what's acceptable oftentimes. So I think there might be an interesting difference there.
Yeah, I really appreciate that. And if you have suggestions about how to get at that, sort of how different, who in the household set these attitudes, like who led who, I'd be very curious to hear them. And one thing I should say is when we think about expanding this, another thing we learned is that people of this age group, for whatever reason, seem to be very good survey subjects in the sense that they'll answer a lot of questions. And so one thing we like the attrition rate on the survey is almost like once people start it, they'll go, and it was a long survey. And so one of the things we plan to do is expand it, and we don't want to limit it. I think there's a lot to learn about race, but I think things about changes in gender norms, for example, I think are something we could learn a lot about. And so, because obviously gender norms changed a lot during that time period, and we want to learn about those types of things too. And so, I guess this is a call to say, if you think of anything you'd like to ask elderly people in the United States, we're trying to survey a bunch of them. So please, send me an email about what you think would be interesting, and we're happy to talk more about that.
I have a question about school districts.
Yeah.
Because I think a lot of the contact is going to be in schools and in school desegregation and redlining with respect to school districts. And I mean, it seems like something that, like if your neighbor next door is in a different school district,
right,
that will really affect the amount, and athletic teams too. I don't know if I'm curious what kinds of records you would have access to, but I expect that people's attendance, in whether they were attending public schools and whether those schools were integrated or not.
Yeah, well, that's a very good question, and especially in the South at that time, the difference between like public and private schools was sort of a fraught issue because of the desegregation that was going on. That the white population in many places essentially left public schools when they were forced to be integrated, and sort of the state sort of set up these kind of like quasi private schools as all sort of a big facade, if you will, and so. The records on this aren't great, but there's ways to get at them. And one thing we can do, which is probably correlated with schools in the South and in the non-South anyway, is look at like contextual diversity. And one of the things that like just, is the area you lived in, not just do you have a Black neighborhood, is the area you lived in have, as a white person, does it have Black people in it? And we find that effect is very swamped in this case by the immediate contact of having a Black neighbor, which I think is interesting unto itself. And so, but that's not exactly schools. Your school's environment's a very important thing when you're a child. So one thing we did in our survey is we just asked them about their school environment, because we said, like, were there Black people in your school? Did you play with them? Things like that. And we can look to see if those are predictive. And we find that, again, once we sort of look at this Black neighbor variable, they're not. But again, they could have problems with memory. Like it could be that people are selecting into them. There could be a lot going on. So there is a researcher, Keith Chen, who's an economist at UCLA, who's written a paper recently looking at school district boundaries in North Carolina, which is where our sample is, and doing something very similar to what we do. And he finds this contextual effect of schools in North Carolina in the 1960s, let's say, some which were segregated and some which were not, that affects partisanship downstream. So there seems to be to your intuition, there seems to be sort of an effect that you can detect durably later on from schools as well. But we'd like to use that sort of same administrative data as well if we could get our hands on it, because I think there's something to be said from that.
I know our time is about to close, but I have one more question that sort of builds on what Anne was asking, which is, could you help us to think about how you think about the implications of having a Black neighbor versus diversity and heterogeneity? And what I'm thinking about is sort of the, Supreme Court rulings, Grutter and Gratz, and, Bakke in 1978, and this idea about the power of diversity, quad diversity. And essentially what your data is, not essentially, your data is showing in a compelling way that it's actually not diversity that matters. It's having a Black neighbor. And even in the analysis that you were just talking about, you sort of suggested that the effect of having a Black neighbor seems to be swamping other effects. Now, one way of thinking about it is that sort of the heterogeneity that's talked about in the school context is qualitatively different. Another way to think about it is that that's a very thin way of thinking about the effect of, that singular kind of diversity on political attitude. So I was just wondering how you are thinking about that vis-a-vis sort of the implications for policy further down the road.
Yeah, so this is a great question, Valerie, and I'll try not to say too much, and I'll try not to say too many things that are inconsistent, because I think I have a lot of different thoughts on this. But one is, so something in my other research I've studied a lot is what you might call sort of diversity, like contextual diversity, right? And I think that often as social scientists, we tend to conflate diversity and contact, where obviously they're not the same thing. Yep. And so I think one value in what we have here is we have maybe actual contact, right? We have the circumstantial evidence for actual contact. There's somebody living next door to you. You have to have at least been exposed to them somehow, right? And that's very different than the situation of having just people in your environment. And something I've shown in other work, actually, I think that proximity without contact in many ways is one of the worst, if you will, situations for driving interethnic prejudice. Because, I use this expression like close but far, where a group is very salient to you because they're in close proximity, but you don't have anything that leads to this interpersonal connections that people like Allport very classically told us makes a difference. And so I think what you perhaps are seeing here is, a manifestation of this very important difference, where schools are interesting because there could be a lot going on in schools where people are in classrooms, and that leads to sort of different types of connections. But putting that aside, where you have people in your community, they might be actually very segregated, which they were in a lot of places. And in my other work, I've shown, I think that segregation matters, that when people are, again, make it a big part of an environment, but they're segregated, that's the worst possible circumstance for intergroup prejudice. So you might have people in your environment that are very segregated. And as social scientists, we look at this data and we say, oh, your environment is diverse. And then we try to correlate it with attitudes, but we actually, aren't showing anything about meaningful contact or anything else that we think might matter. And here we're showing it. And so I think that distinction is really important. And maybe they're actually in tension at times.
Interesting. Well, thank you so much. I think on that note, we are going to formally close. Thank you, all of you who are here today. Thank you also to Ryan, tremendous work, and at least in my opinion, are all for good. So thank you so much.
Thank you.